are back in the book of Mark, and we have kind of been a little all over the place. We've been in our title series. We finished that up last week, and we're back in the book of Mark. We started back in chapter 1 in the end of July, so we are going through this entire book passage by passage, verse by verse. And really what the book of Mark is doing is we approach it and we're asking the question, who is Jesus? You are going to either have to crown him or kill him based with what this tells us about who Jesus is. Who is he? It's not just this thing of I need to watch what Jesus did and live exactly like him, but is Jesus actually the power and the authority and the God of the universe? And then Mark is kind of asking us that same question back. Like, okay, so he's revealing that Jesus is God. He's shown us that Jesus is all these things. And Mark is asking us the question that we then get to reflect on, and what will you do with him? What will you do with this Jesus? And if you guys get the chance, you guys should go and check out the very first message from this book of Mark, and you guys can find that on our YouTube channel. And Chris was talking about this word called shmicha. Can you say it in your way? Shmicha. In the Jewish way? Shmicha. Thank you. If you guys didn't know, Chris has the heritage of a Jewish man, so we're all proud of him. But the shmicha and this idea that God gave authority to Jesus, and we see that in the very first chapter, and then the rest of the passages of Mark, one thing that's happening is that we're seeing Mark and Jesus and this book revealing more and more and more what Jesus actually has authority over. It's very action-packed. You'll notice that Mark has a lot less of the like flowery and a lot less of the details. He kind of leaves some details out that we're like, what's going on here? We'll see some of that later, but it's really exciting. But he's just really action-packed. Look, Jesus can do this. Look, Jesus can do this. Look, Jesus can do this. Look, this isn't just what Jesus can do. This is who Jesus is. And so when we get to the book of Mark, we're going to be stuck today in Mark 6 towards the end of that chapter. But I'm just going to take you guys through so that we can remember, okay, Mark, this is what Jesus has authority over. And starting in chapter 1, I'm just going to take you guys through this, and you guys get settled in Mark 6. But in Mark 1:27, we see that that Jesus has the authority over impure spirits. He has the authority over the spiritual realm. Later in that chapter, Mark 1:31, we see that he has the power over sickness and body. We see him heal people. We see him do that multiple times in the book of Mark, but we see that right here. Boom, Jesus has the authority over your own body, over your own sickness, over your own healing. In Mark 2:10, it says that he has the authority to forgive sins. This is not just some he can do these tricks. He actually has the authority to forgive sins. He has authority over sin. In Mark 2:27, we see that he has power and authority over the law. That this is, in fact, Jesus has authority over the entire Jewish law that they've been living by forever and ever. The law was actually made for man and not for God. Jesus, has authority over the law. And he fulfills the law. Side note. Okay, Mark 4:35, we see that he has power over wind and seas. That he is able to, in fact, stop a storm and make the sea calm. He has power over our universe elements. And then in Mark 5:42, we see, perhaps for the first time, that God has the power to bring dead things to life. He raises a girl from the dead. That he actually has the authority over death itself. And then, right before we get to the passage that we're in, we see that Jesus, he makes loaves and fish. He makes more and more and more, and he multiplies it. He actually makes something out of nothing, and he shows it to the people around him. He can create matter. I don't know if you guys ever watched Bill Nye the Science Guy, but you can't create matter. Everything's made of something else, but Jesus created matter. And then this is the part we go to. And it's in Mark 6, verse 45. If you guys want to read along with me, it says, immediately, Jesus made his disciples get into the boat and go on ahead of him to Bethsaida, while he dismissed the crowd. After leaving them, he went up on a mountainside to pray. Later that night, the boat was in the middle of the lake, and he was alone on land. He saw the disciples straining at the oars because the wind was against them. So Jesus has sent them ahead. He sent them into the lake on a boat together. And they said, cross the Sea of Galilee. I'm going to go up on this mountainside and pray. Dismisses the crowd, goes on the mountainside to pray. And then this is what happens. Shortly before dawn, he went out to them, walking on the lake. He was about to pass them by. But when they saw him walking on the lake, they thought he was a ghost. And notice how the disciples who have been walking with him through all of these things of saying, whoa, Jesus has authority over this, and this. Jesus has authority over all things, is what we've seen. This is how they respond to seeing him walk on water. But when they saw him walking on the lake, they thought he was a ghost. They cried out because they all saw him and were terrified. Immediately, he spoke to them and said, "Take courage. It is I. Don't be afraid." Then he climbed into the boat with them, and the wind died down. The wind just died down. Okay, that's cool. They were completely amazed. This word amazed is, you can also kind of translate it as astonished at something that is out of place. This idea, out of place, is a big part of this amazed word and this astonished word. They believed that they were amazed by it. They were astonished. They saw something that was so out of place. For they had not understood about the loaves. The loaves is the miracle that had just happened when he created something out of nothing. They hadn't understood that. Their hearts were hardened. When they had crossed over, they landed at Gennesaret and anchored there. As soon as they got out of the boat, people recognized Jesus. They ran throughout the whole region and carried the sick on mats to wherever they heard he was. And wherever he went, into villages, towns, or countryside, they placed the sick in the marketplaces. They begged him to let them touch even the edge of his cloak, and all who touched were healed. The 12 disciples who had followed Jesus, they have seen Jesus literally raise someone from a dead, make something out of nothing, heal sickness, calm the wind and the seas. They've already seen him do this. Just a couple verses before, he calms a storm. They've seen him do it, yet the words to describe these people who are being revealed of Jesus' majesty and glory and power, these are the words. They says that they are terrified. They are afraid. Jesus says, don't be afraid, so they must have been afraid. They are astonished, amazed, seeing something out of place. That when they see Jesus' power of walking on a lake, they are terrified. They are taken back. And it says that's because they had not understood. They hadn't understood. They had seen that he could do these things, but they hadn't quite come face to face with the fact of who Jesus is. They didn't know who he was. And what we get to talk about today in our message is that when we know who Jesus is, we aren't surprised by his power. They were so utterly shocked, terrified, astonished, surprised by his power. When we know who Jesus is, we aren't surprised by his power, but in fact, we get to rest in the covering of his power. And as we kind of talk about this passage and the fact that they were so shocked and terrified and that they need courage and that they shouldn't be afraid because it's Jesus, that's the thing, is that hinges on the fact of who is Jesus. That when we know who he is, we aren't surprised by his power, but we can rest in the covering of his power.
There's kind of this paradox that exists inside of the personhood of Jesus, right? There's kind of this dialectic disposition that the Bible wants us to hold on to each side of this tension. In fact, I would make the argument that every supreme movement in bad theology throughout the past 2,000 years is when someone lets go of one side of who God is to exacerbate or to lift up the other, when the Bible wants us to hold two things in tension. Okay, so if I ask you the question, is Jesus lion or lamb? What's the answer? Yes, right? Yes, he is. If I said, is God a God of wrath or a God of mercy? Your answer should be yes. And if I said, does God, when someone says, I want to be saved, does he say, sell everything you have and give to the poor? Or surely I tell you right now you're going to be saved? Which one does he do? Both. He's this God of both and. He's a God of, and it's not contradictory if he said, listen, I am only wrath and then mercy showed up, we would go, you're wrong. But contradiction and paradox are two different things. Our God is very paradoxical. He has both sides of the same character. And what's important to understand is Jesus never lets one side go to employ the other, and he never overdoes one and lessen the other. God is all characteristics of himself at all times, and he doesn't give one up in order to showcase another side of it. We are capable, because we are finite beings, which makes us very different than the infinite God. We are finite of one emotion at one time in the male gender, right? Females, you have a superpower, which is to feel many things at once, right? It's like the great theologian Harry Potter, or I guess Ron Weasley once said, no one could feel all those things at the same time, they'd explode, right? Hermione's like, well, Cho Chan's probably feeling this way because she feels pressure, and this way because she feels embarrassed, and this way because she feels, and then Ron Weasley, one person couldn't feel all that, they'd explode. Which is beautiful. That's kind of how we're supposed to hold the tension of God. You couldn't be all those things. You're right. You couldn't be all those things, but he can. And what we tend to do then is when we see God's power, we go, well, you focus way too much on God's power, not enough on God's love. Well, the Old Testament's way too much about God's wrath, not enough about God's mercy. But they're not different. God's power displays his love. God's love is only important if his power is there. Why would it matter if an impotent, insufficient, unworthy God loved you? Would that mean anything? If a fake, false, ideological, misinterpreted, not good for anything God loved you, why would you sing about him? If he wasn't also powerful enough to take away sin, to beat death, to overcome, if he wasn't powerful enough in that his purpose of loving you would just be like, who cares if that guy loves me? Who cares if a fake God or if an impotent God? No one cares. It is that they are both held in tandem that God's love means anything. When we say phrases like, for God so loved the world, we also understand that word God means he has the ability to scrap it and start over, or to kill us with a single breath, and yet for that God so loved the world. His love wouldn't mean anything without his power, and his power wouldn't mean anything without his love. They're not opposed to one another. They hold hands. They're married. They walk hand in hand throughout Scripture. I want to display this to you in the book of Exodus, chapter 33. If you guys want to turn there, you don't have to. I got to kind of race through it because we don't have a lot of time. Exodus 33, this man named Moses, who God sends to Pharaoh and says, Moses, I want you to go tell Pharaoh to let his slave force go. Now, if you don't know anything about the history of the Egyptians used Hebrews and a number of other groups to build their pyramids, to build their tombs, they became a great nation on the back of slaves. So he says, Moses, here's what I want you to do. I have heard the cry of my people in Egypt, says God, and I want you to go and tell Pharaoh, who thinks he's a god. That's Pharaoh. He believed that he was God himself. Go tell God, Moses, for I am Yahweh, God says. God says, I am the God. Yahweh, that word means I am. I was, I am, I always will be. So God identifies himself, right? We can call him Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. We can call him all these things. But ultimately, when God reveals his name, like imagine if it was you and I talking. I would go, yes, I'm a pastor. Yes, I'm a father. Yes, I'm a husband. You can call me Chris. This is what God does in the book of Exodus chapter 3. He says, yes, I am Almighty. I am Wonderful Counselor. I am Mighty God. I'm Everlasting Father. I am Prince of Peace. You can call me Yahweh. And that word Yahweh means I am. He is isness. He always was, he is, he always will be. Everything that has come about came through him. He is ultimate power. Then in Exodus 33, after quoting his divine name being I am, or Yahweh, Moses says, let me see your power. And God, almost kerfuffled, goes, you want to see I can't show you the power of God. You would die, right? Like you would explode. And so God goes, but here, I'll make a deal with you. So in Exodus 33, he makes a deal with Moses. He says, Moses, I'm going to throw you up into the crevice of a rock facing away from me. And then I'm going to manifest my power here on earth for a split second, and then I'm going to take it away. Then I'm going to count to 5, and at the end of 5, I want you to turn around and look at where I used to be. And just that is going to overwhelm you. That's what it says. In the text, it says, you can see my back, God says. But the Hebrew translation means you can look at where I used to be. So God, in all of his infinite power, comes in. He shows his glory in one moment, like all of God's glory shows up in physical form, And then he takes it back away and he goes, okay, Moses, ready? Turn. And what, is that like, is someone airdropping something to someone? And then in the middle of all of that, what happens is Moses goes, he turns around and he's overwhelmed. In fact, what the response that God wants Moses to have is this. Here's what Exodus 34 says. As soon as Moses turns around, he declares, the Lord, abundant in compassion, overflowing with love for his people from generation to generation. What caused Moses to understand the love of God? It was God's power. You see, the power of God brings us comfort and peace in his love. If we served an impotent God, his love wouldn't mean anything. And if we served a loving God or if we served a powerful God who wasn't loving, then we would just be going, wow, can't wait till you murder all of us because you're just brutal. It is because those two things are held in perfect tandem that we are able to see the perfection of God's character. And let me ask you a question. What is the most important event in the history of mankind? There's one day that stands out above all the rest. What's the most important day that has ever happened in the history of mankind? I believe secular or not, whether you're coming here and you're not a Christian, which I know a lot of you guys, you just here because you're checking it out, you don't follow Jesus, that's cool. We're glad that you're here. You're skeptical, you've got huge doubts, welcome. Okay, we all struggle with doubts. Please, always feel welcome into this community. Now, secular or non-secular, what's the most important day in the history of mankind? The alleged day that Jesus Christ of Nazareth came back from the dead. I'll say alleged in case you're not there. The alleged day. Because if Jesus didn't come back from the dead, then he'd be dead with all the other prophets, all the other people who claim to be God. But the fact that there was a day which in history, there was alleged that this man came back from the dead and then showed himself to 500 different people. And early Christian writers and non-Christian writers wrote about this resurrection of this man, that you and I's clocks are the way that they are, that our calendars are the way that they are, that we started counting up in our years starting on that day because everything changed. This guy called his shot and then pulled off Easter. Now, think about the disciples' case. With everything the disciples were given, he's got the power to overcome the unclean spirits, to bring the dead back to life, to make the lame to walk, to make the blind to see, to make the mute to talk, to make the deaf to hear. He does this over and over again. Partly why? Why is he doing this? It is so that on the most important day in the history of mankind, what are his disciples doing? Are they there at the tomb waiting for him to come out? No, what are they doing? They're afraid. They're tucked in, they're terrified. I believe the miracles in the book of Mark, this is all an appeal of God to his people going, if I can do this, can't I do this? And if I can do this, can't I do this? And if I can do this, can't I do this? So that the day where he goes, I have shown the power over death, sin, the grave, demon. I've shown my power over all that stuff. Now here's what's going to happen. I'm going to die, but I'm going to come back to life. So that the leap of faith for a non-believer would not be day one, Jesus shows up and goes, trust me, I'm going to come back from the dead. And then he steps with them every step of the process. He condescends. He walks with them going, if I can do that, can I do? If I can do that. Even today, 2,000 years later, we have to read through the book of Mark Jesus' love for us as he performs these miracles. And if you're struggling in your life with some kind of natural disaster that happened to you, guess what? He has power over natural disaster. Mark tells us that. If you're struggling with shame, guess what Mark tells us? He's the God over shame. If you're struggling with the sin, guess what? He showed he's got the power over sin. Every example in Scripture of God's power over something is an assurance for us as his children that God's got it. He's got it under control. We have to read his love into the very miraculous passages that have to do with his power.
I think that when we see God's power show up or play out, it's often we can kind of start addressing in our lives like, okay, like where is God's power going to come in and be a part of my life? Or where is God's power void of my life? And with that, we either blame God for something that's happening in our life, or we are shocked and terrified and have that like astonished, like, oh my gosh, God actually did something, whoa. But here's the thing, if you are walking and you believe that you are with Jesus, that he is in you, he in fact dwells with you, that he is the God of your life, God's power doesn't ever leave you. And it doesn't just show up. And so that means that as your life goes in a series of events, and as you go from circumstance to circumstance and conversation to conversation and moment by moment, that God's power is in fact covering that moment. And so even in the storm and even in the toil and even in the work and even in the suffering, how are we able to sit and say, like, even in the midst of this, how possibly could God's power be covering this? How could God's love possibly be covering this? Because we know that it's true. We know that he is the I am. We know that he is the overall. We know that he is, in fact, the God of love and compassion, that he is the God of justice, that he is the God of mercy, that he is the God of all of these things, and he is, in fact, with you, and he is powerful over all things, that he has the ability, he could technically do anything in your life. And so we have to believe that his power is, in fact, covering even the details and moments of your day-to-day. But how can we rest? How can we find peace? How can we find assurance that God is in fact there and with us, and his power is a protection and a safety and a security for us, even in the midst of the storm, even in the midst of the trial? And my answer for you is going to sound so Christian and cliche, and my answer for you is prayer. And here's the reason, is that prayer is much more than us asking God to do something when we need him, or being mad at God when he doesn't do something that we ask him to do. Prayer is, in fact, the catalyst for relationship with God, and it is a method to do that. Prayer for us does two things. Number one, it solidifies and it cements and it lets us live our life day to day, moment by moment, not just our prayer moment, but our entire life moment. I guess life isn't just, I don't know. Okay, it lets us live our entire life with the fact that God is there and he is with us and we are in relationship with him. It is a catalyst for relationship. And that's going to build trust with him. But on the other side, it is also an acknowledgement and a submission to the fact that he actually does have power. And this is why. So we see that first part kind of on relationship with God as being a huge thing, to see God's power in every circumstance. And we see Jesus actually living this out. That relationship isn't about just when we need God. And that's because Jesus himself, who is in complete relationship with God at all times, who doesn't necessarily need anything from him. He is holy. He is perfect in himself. He's not just running to God when he feels shameful or bad about himself, but he's actually living life with God. We see him do that in the very beginning of this same passage. And it says, immediately, Jesus made his disciples get into the boat and go on ahead of him to Bethsaida, while he dismissed the crowd. After leaving them, he went up on a mountainside to pray. That Jesus, who is already in relationship with God, made separate time to go and spend time in prayer with God. Jesus himself. We can say Jesus had a lot of very important things to get to. Jesus had a crowd around him. How often do we just say, I didn't make time for that today, I was needed today. I was needed for God's kingdom today. Even that seems like a good excuse. Or look, all these people wanted something from me. All these people needed something from me. Jesus himself dismissed a crowd to go and spend time with his heavenly Father. To go and spend time praying with God. Not just because he needed God to give him something, but because that's actually a way that we get to know and have this intimate familiarity with God himself. And one of the highest callings that the Bible tells us in our life is to actually know God. And this word know isn't just a head knowledge. This word know is translated as an intimate familiarity. One that you have with your friend. You don't just have an intimate familiarity of knowing someone I just know her by knowing about her or knowing about him. But do you know that person as an intimate friend? And this relationship is so important. And I remember sitting around a picnic table with some friends, and there's this older woman that was helping us in this ministry that we were a part of. And one of the girls just asks, what is prayer? And this sweet lady, Pam, she just is like, you know what? I think that prayer for me is spending time with the one who loves me the most. And I walked away from that conversation, and it's been something that's just kind of been in my head of whoa, if this is the God who loves me, and this is the God who has power over everything and has a calling on my life, why would I not want to spend time with him? Prayer is a conversation of relationship. Another thing that happens in prayer that we get to do is to acknowledge that God's power is over everything and to submit to it. God, your will be done, not my own. God, I know you are able. So in this situation, God, you must be present somehow. What is in this that I can glean from and know you more in and worship you more in? As we submit to the fact that he is powerful, as we acknowledge the fact that he is powerful, then we don't just see his power show up, we actually see his power in everything. That if his power is covering everything and his power is able to do anything, that then what we're living in, that what God has called us to, that he is actually with us in it instead of just randomly showing up and intervening and being like, oh, that was God's power. See, further down in this passage, it says that Jesus made his disciples get into the boat and go. He made them get into a boat and strain, and it says at the oars. It says straining at the oars because the wind was against them. This was God. Jesus himself said, here's what you're going to do. You're going to get in a boat, and you're going to go, and you're going to row, and the wind is going to push you back, and it may look like you're not even making progress, but this is what I've called you to do. When we pray to God and ask him to do something for us and just say like, okay, God's going to handle it, and I'm not going to do anything. I'm not going to touch it. I'm not going to whatever, like, God's got this, let go and let God, we're actually not being faithful movers to what he's called us to do. God has a purpose for your life. God has very clearly told us that we need to be walking with him and for him and beside him, that he has things for us to do, that we are to be kingdom makers and for God's kingdom, that we are to be faithful movers, and that God will be present throughout that moving, and that we don't just stick up our hands and be like, God's going to do it. He clearly gives them a responsibility. And them to do their responsibility isn't dependent on the outcome if it's hard right now or the wind is against me. And here's the cool thing. I was talking with Kim Bates earlier, and she was telling me, she's like, you know what? When they got in the boat, they weren't in the boat alone. We're not meant to be straining at the oars alone. And that when we get to see that God is a power over all things, and he is in all things, and he is with you in all things, then when we're straining, we're not like, oh, God's power isn't here right now. We're able to see that God's power is actually with us in this moment, and that this is what we're called to do, and in his power, we're going to be strong as we continue to be faithful movers. Another thing how we get prayer wrong is how we just kind of assume, like, okay, I'm going to do everything I can, and then when I finish that, like, I'll do my little prayer to make this like a holy moment or to get God's blessing over it, and then he's just going to bless it, but I've done everything I can. And this idea that it's just kind of this like religious pixie dust, that he's going to make what I've done and make it better, that's just wrong. That's not how God's power works. It's not that God's power shows up like at this specific moment because you've asked him to do this specific thing. God's power is actually present throughout your entire life. And when we can believe that, and when we are in conversation with God and able to submit to the authority of that through prayer and be in an intimate familiarity with God's character, with who he is, with how he's working, when we know him in that way, in this prayer and in this power of God and recognizing God's power, we actually get to find deep, deep rest and peace through all circumstances and through all straining and striving and through all things he's called us to. And then when God shows up, it's not that he just showed up out of nowhere, but it's that he's been working all along. I would so much rather live a life where I believe that God's power is present in every moment instead of like, okay, God, when are you going to show up? When are you going to show up here? When are you going to show up here? No. God is already present here. He's already powerful here. He has the ultimate and final victory and power over death itself when he raised himself from the dead. He has the final word. And that's the power that we get to live in, and we get to experience that and live in it in prayer.
One of the funny things about reading this passage in particular is how many of you guys are familiar with this story? You heard of it, like you heard this story when you were in preschool or kindergarten or whatever. Maybe you even know it from like a secular worldview, where like this is a pretty famous story. It's like the song "Oceans" by Hillsong. Like, Spirit, lead me where my trust is. Let me walk upon the waters wherever Jews would call me. You ever heard that song? So it's my spin on it. Okay, but you read this story. What's missing? And isn't there a funny? There's a little nuance. There's another story inside the story that we're used to listening to, used to hearing here. And maybe when you heard that we're going to study Jesus walking on water today, you went, oh, cool. That means we're going to get to hear about Peter, isn't there a story in here where doesn't one of the disciples go, let me walk on water, and then Jesus goes, come on out to me, and then this guy walks on water out to him, and then the wind picks up and he gets scared and he falls in the water and Jesus grabs him and then says, how dare you doubt me? And then puts him back in the boat. And then he calms the storm and goes, what's your deal, man? You started walking on water. If I told you to walk on liquid, it doesn't matter if the storm picks up. If I told you to walk on water, why would anything sideswipe you? What are you doing? Just think. If you knew someone in your life and they told you, come walk on this body of water, and you just full confidence we're going to drown, and you went, what the? And then there was like a mongoose on the shore, and you were like, mongoose? And then you fell, you'd be like, look, if this guy can save you from going underneath water, like if he can create surface tension so strong, can hold a grown man, who cares about mongoose? No one cares. Mongoose? Mongoosin? Mongoose? Sis? Mongoose? Nelly, you're a liar. Mongoose. Anyway, this is the point. But here's the issue. When we know, historically speaking, there's a tradition about who actually spoke the Gospel of Mark. Mark wrote it down, but Mark wasn't a first-hand eyewitness to all the events of Jesus. In fact, historians like Josephus, Tacitus, these guys tell us that the actual person who's describing these events was an illiterate man who had an inability to write named Peter. So in Peter's gospel that he spoke to Mark to write, what part is missing? The embarrassing, faithless moment. So when Peter goes, one time Jesus walked on water. I wonder if Mark was like, oh, that's right, I remember that story. You fell? And he's, no. You see, Matthew and Luke are going to pick it up and go, oh yeah, that guy fell in the water. But Peter's like, let's just leave that part out. We're going to wrap up with this. And then if the band wants to come forward and get ready to close us in song. Why does Peter not include, like Peter is called, he's the one who God gives the keys of the kingdom to. It says that Peter his name is changed from Simon to Rock, because on this rock, God's going to build his church. Because of the truth that he says in Mark chapter 16, I believe that it is. Mark chapter, I don't know, somewhere in Mark. And Peter is told 3 times, feed my sheep, feed my sheep, feed my sheep. Jesus loves this man. He's one of the 3 that follow Jesus around everywhere. There's 12 disciples, but whenever he does something really intimate, like the transfiguration, there's Peter, James, and John go with him. He's one of the 3 closest, and yet he still lives in enough shame that when he writes his gospel, he goes, leave that part out. Here's what this needs to mean for us in our lives. If a God has power over all these things, and yet we still live in shame, the question I want to pose to you this morning, do we believe that God is who he says he is here and here, or just here? Is God who he says he is? We go, yes. No. I don't want you to repeat the Sunday school answer. Because I think the problem with the Christian church today is a lot of us live with the only conviction of God being real and alive and with us and loving us and powerful. It only exists right here. We're bold in our speech. We're weak in our heart. We're bold in our speech, and yet we digress in our mind. When God says, I want you to love me, the Shema says, love Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. And we go, what about just my lips? What about just what I say out loud? What about just this one part of my week? God goes, that's not going to do anything for you. If you're showing up to Christianity to have it do something for you and it's failing you, it's because you think that God's job is to intrinsically serve you. What you're going to find is you're going to realize what Christianity is the moment where you lay it down and you start to serve him. When there is a conviction of the heart beyond just the speech of the mouth. And Peter, as much as he knows who Jesus is, still leaves this out. And let me challenge you guys with something. How many times do you think Peter, even at an old age, would hear that voice in the back of his head go, I can't believe you doubted Jesus on the water. Or, I can't believe that you denied Jesus 3 times before his crucifixion. it was so permeating of his thought that we can speculate that he left out that part of the story because he was still embarrassed by it. Some of us, when we come to church, we put on this projection of who we think God wants us to be, and it's just false. I don't think that your time or your energy is worth going to church or your growth group if you're not going to bring who you actually are to those two places. Like, I don't think God died so we could all show up and have some happy-go-lucky club about how good we are as people. Could you imagine just the weeping Jesus would do if he walked in here and those of us who just kind of fake this and live like hell for the rest of the week and then show up and go, cool, got my Jesus box checked. Do you think he would go, oh, that so edifies my crucifixion? That's so meaningful for why I came, that you could fake it for 2 hours a week? Yes. And you go, well, then what do I do? Let me tell you. The reason that you have an inability to lean in to the gospel and lean in to what God has called you to do is because shame has so taken hold of your life that you have surrendered to it. But here's what you tell yourself. Yes, I still live in shame. I still haven't forgiven myself for that. I still haven't experienced God's grace in that department. But the other 98% of my life is going great. Here's what you need to know about Satan. He's a crafty serpent. He's not going to use what you're powerful in. He's going to use what you're weak in. If Satan's objective is to keep you away from the Father, to experience the love of a Father, you're like, well, at least I'm not smoking hardcore drugs. Well, Satan would never tempt you with that. Well, how come? I would say no, because he's already got you sleeping with your boyfriend. He doesn't need anything else. If you've got a weakness and he is truly crafty and intelligent, why would he go after your strength? That doesn't make any sense. Like if you walked in a room and I said, all you need to do is beat up one person, and there was like 8 bodybuilders and one like scrawny 7-year-old, how many of you would go, Dwayne Johnson? You. No, you'd be stupid. And Satan does the same thing with your life. He goes, no, you love your friends. You're great with your parents. You found your identity in that area. Good, good, good. Ah, shame. Shame from what you did 2 summers ago, where you went too far with him, and now you can't even raise your hands in worship because you're so embarrassed by that. I'm going to go to the same person. I'm going to beat up the same person every time. If Satan is knocking on the door to your home and he realizes that the front door of your home is open so that he can come and get a foothold, he's not going to check every window before he enters your house. He doesn't need it. If everything else in your house is locked, but one thing is gaping wide open, make no mistake, he'll walk through that day in and day out until you turn your test of your past into the testimony of your future. This is what I've experienced in my life, is when I live in shame and then I start talking to people about it, and then I start helping other people through the same scenario that I once went through, guess who stops bringing that crap up? Satan. You want to know why? Because when he brings it up, more people come to know Jesus. And he hates that. But some of us right here, we live in like this incumbent fear in our life. And we go, why does Satan keep bringing it up? Because you keep letting it be part of your past instead of part of the testimony of your future. I'm going to challenge you guys with this. If there's something in your life and you're in your growth group this week or you're with your mentor, even that part that you think is unforgivable or is too ugly to bring out, I guarantee you one thing. That's the junk he died for. And until you let his grace wash over your shame, that grace will define you. It's not until you give it up and you allow his test to become part of your testimony that Satan will go, I got to find a new door to unlock. I got to find a new way of breaking in. We will experience true freedom if and only if we have a conviction of our soul. And this is the question I want to ask. We're going to end with a time of worship with Charlie and the gang. And here's the question. In this book of Mark, what are you going to do with Jesus? Are you going to crucify him or are you going to king him? The very words we're saying, do you believe it on your lips or do you believe it in your heart? Is it a conviction of your mind or is it simply the words on your tongue? If it's just the words in your tongue, when you're singing this song, after every phrase, I want you to say this question to yourself, quietly so you're not super annoying. Do I truly live like that's truth? Do I live like that's truth or do I just believe that might be truth? The first phrase is, God, I look to you and I won't be overwhelmed. God, I look to you, you're where my help comes from. Is that true? Or is that what you want to be true? And you might be on a path where you do truly want it to be true and it's not there for you yet. Awesome, keep going. But if you sit here in this confidence of, I'm a Christian, I don't need anything else, I know the Bible, but you can't ask yourself that question in the affirmative. Do I live like this is truth? Let me challenge you. Don't sit in a place where you think that you're found if you're truly lost inside. God came to die for that too.